Ian, welcome to the first of our Friday community events. We're going to start having these regularly monthly before our relaxed services. And to start us off, really we have a wonderful guest who's going to speak to us. Katherine Martinko is able to join us this evening. She's an editor, a professional editor in lots of different media, and also an author. And her first book is Childhood Unplugged, copies of which are on the table there, and I know she's going to talk about some of that in her talk. She, in addition to her book, she also has a newsletter and a blog. She writes prolifically online and in other media, including the Globe and Mail and other outlets, about this issue of childhood, technology, families, and other related issues. She came to speak to us all the way from Port Elgin. She grew up in Muskoka originally, attended the University of Toronto, and so she is an Ontarian who's lived in many parts of the province. So without further ado, Katherine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me come speak to you this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I had a nice 3-hour drive this afternoon from Port Elgin to get here. There was no traffic until I hit the 401, and that reminded me of why I do like living in a small town. But because I went to U of T and lived downtown for 5 years of my life, I do love a good reason to come back to the city. So this is definitely a good one. So I am, as mentioned, the author of Childhood Unplugged, Practical Advice to Get Kids Off Screens and Find Balance. This is my first book. It came out a year and a half ago. And I've worked in environmental journalism, actually, for the better part of a decade. And then I sort of transitioned into this topic of kids and technology because it started to interest me a lot. And the timing could not have been better. Just over the past year and a half, it kind of went from being this niche topic that people raised an eyebrow at when I told them what I was writing about to something that everybody seems to care about. And it crosses generations. It's something that even if you have kids or you don't have kids, if you're an educator, if you're a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, just someone in our society in general, it seems that you are thinking about digital media and how it's affecting yourself as well as any of the children that you may know. My focus tends to be on kids primarily, but I think a lot of the points that I make and the information I'm providing is relevant to all of us. So as mentioned as well, I do write as a contributor for the Globe and Mail. I write about every 2 to 3 weeks a column about technology and kids. I have an email newsletter called The Analog Family, and I write twice a week for that. A number of different articles touching on what it means to sort of live a more offline, intentional, connected life. And then some really exciting news, actually effective today, is I've joined the team for the Anxious Generation. So there's this author, Jonathan Haidt, who came out with a book this year, and it has just exploded. He's kind of the biggest name right now in this whole field of digital media. So I'm now working with his team, which is great because we're trying to disseminate this message even more than ever about needing to get kids off screens and reclaim childhood as the adventure, play-filled stage of life that it's meant to be. So my interest, though, is not just professional. I am a mother as well, so it's deeply personal. I have 3 sons. You can see them there. They're ages 9, 12, and 15. So I like to say that I have kids that range from, well, they're in elementary, middle, and high school. So really, I have kids at every single stage of our educational system, and I am dealing with all of these things. All of you might be, or your grandchildren might be, on a daily basis. I'm hearing the stories from the inside. So I'm not just sort of this outside researcher, observer of what's happening. It's definitely, I'm in the trenches with my kids. So my goals for today, I will be covering some of the problems associated with digital media. Also some of the very good things about digital media. I'm not anti-tech in any way, and I'm going to be talking about that as well. But we will do an overview of some of the darker stuff that a lot of kids particularly are being exposed to online. I will be introducing the concept of digital minimalism, which is a philosophy that I have found to be very effective for handling technology in a healthy, balanced way. And I will be offering practical solutions that will help you feel empowered by the time you leave at the end of the day. If you are dealing with children or wanting to address even your own habits, hopefully you will feel like you have something you can implement immediately. There's a lot of content to get through. I will be moving quickly, talking a lot, but if you have any questions afterwards, there will be some minutes for Q&A, and please feel free to ask me any questions, and I'll be around after if you would like to discuss. There's some disturbing content here as well. We don't have any really little kids, so that's good. But I think that it's important to kind of get a handle sometimes on what is actually out there. I don't think that we as adults even know how bad it is, the things that younger kids are being exposed to. So what is digital media? Well, of course, it is a very broad term. It refers to any kind of information that's being conveyed through electronic devices with screens. But I sort of divide it into two camps mentally. I think of the devices. We've got portable devices like the smartphones and the tablets. And then we've got the apps and the platforms that are supported by these tools. It's the combination of the two that has made this uniquely catastrophic situation for a lot of young people in particular. So a smartphone on its own is not inherently bad. It's actually quite amazing, impressive technology. And a social media platform isn't necessarily bad. If you're accessing it in a healthy way, maybe on a standalone desktop computer that you're logging into once a day, when you combine the two, when you put these extremely irresistible, alluring apps onto a portable device that is in your pocket that you can pick up every 60 seconds for 24 hours a day, you end up with this social bomb that's going off, and that's what we are dealing with right now. So there have always been, outrage about new technology, and a lot of people say phones are just the latest iteration of technological advancement. We're freaking out too much. We shouldn't be this panicked about it. People were worried when the printing press came out in 1440 that it was going to change knowledge the way that we know it. And it did. In many ways it did. However, we did not have people who were compulsively reading books. Maybe there are a few exceptions, but unable to sleep, unable to eat, all of their personal relationships falling apart, completely incapacitated socially. And yet that's kind of what we're seeing on the more extreme end of digital media addiction. These tools are designed differently than anything that has been designed up until now. They are portable, like I mentioned before, so you can never get away from them. They're probably on us all right now, or at least close by. They are designed to suck us in. So they are designed for compulsive use. They're extremely, very hard to resist, and we know this as adults. It's even far worse for children. And there is growing evidence now that it's been a number of years since we started using these devices on a regular basis that it is rewiring kids' brains particularly. So neurological pathways in the brain are definitely changing as a result of excessive screen time. So this has been described as the great rewiring of childhood. This is a phrase that was developed by Jonathan Haidt, that psychologist who wrote The Anxious Generation that I mentioned earlier. He gives this sort of timeline of just to show how quickly things have changed from the way that kids have been raised up until just the latest little shortest blip in history. So starting in 2007, the first smartphone was invented. 2010, we got forward-facing camera launched with the iPhone 4. And around then, so 2011, only 23% of US teens owned smartphones. By 2012, Instagram was purchased by Facebook, and it grew from having 10 million to 90 million users in just 1 year. And a big reason for that was because of this forward-facing camera. It became possible for teenage girls in particular to be able to take selfies and post these selfies online, and this became the hottest social trend of the time. And since then, teenagers have been inseparable from their smartphones. Phone ownership has surged. 2016, 79% of teens had smartphones, and then by 2024, now we've got 95% ownership among teens. And when screen time goes up, everything else changes. It's one of those things where you can't really have this much of one thing without it affecting everything else. Social patterns have changed. Role models have changed. So young people are looking up to different people as examples of who they want to be. Physical activity levels have changed. Emotions, of course, are being affected by exposure to a lot of this content online, and then sleep patterns as well have been significantly altered. We know we have a big problem. So when you look at the latest statistics, this was from an organization called Common Sense Media, the daily total entertainment screen use time for tweens, so these are kids between the ages of 8 and 12, they're on their devices for 5.5 hours a day. For teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18, they are on their devices for 8 hours and 40 minutes on average every day. And I would like to draw your attention to the word entertainment. So this is not screen time that's being used for school. It's not being used for homework, for any kind of research, for any sort of work purposes, anything. This is strictly entertainment. And some parents will say that the time is being used constructively, but I assure you, your child is not using their screen time constructively. When you actually look at the time use studies, the majority of the time, so 4.8 hours out of the teenagers' 8.5 hours is being spent on social media. Primarily YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and then other common online activities in order of preference include gaming, streaming videos, messaging, and browsing the internet. So I think of this as just sort of a basic math problem. Like when you spend that much time on social media, close to 5 hours a day as a teenager alone, that's a whole lot of time that you're not spending doing other things that arguably might be a bit more formative and a bit more helpful to you as you were growing up to become a successful adult. What are some of the effects of too much screen time? Well, we obviously have physical effects. There's a lot of sedentariness. 8 hours and 40 minutes a day of entertainment-based screen time is going to require you to sit on your bed or lie on a couch and just not do a whole lot. So I interviewed a pediatric occupational therapist when I wrote my book, and she talked about all these injuries that they're seeing in kids because the bodies are not developing optimally. You've got kids who are tripping over their own feet, who are falling out of their chairs, who can't balance on one foot because they lack just the quantity of outdoor, free, active physical playtime that a child is evolutionarily required to grow well, but are simply not getting anymore. There's a lot of sleep issues that we are seeing too. So quantity and quality of sleep are being impaired by exposure to too many screens. Obviously, it's hard to put down a screen when you're watching something that's very alluring. We know this as adults when Netflix is autoplaying and the next episode of your favorite show could begin, or you could go to bed an hour early. It's hard to resist. Kids struggle with that too. And of course, just exposure to the screens, the blue light emitted by the screens. You may know it inhibits the release of melatonin, which is the hormone in your body that induces sleepiness. So it can be very hard for young children to come down from exposure to screen time, particularly at night in the hours leading up to bed. Emotionally, we've got kids who are being exposed to really immature content online, and I think often parents are underestimating just how disturbing some of the stuff is that they're seeing, and kids struggle with that. There's a lot of social isolation, a lot of loneliness. Neurologically, we know that the brain is being conditioned to create short video formats. You know, when a kid's watching TikTok, those snippets are only about 20 seconds long, and so it becomes the length of time that the child is able to focus on information. And the brain is adaptive, it's very elastic, so you can train a child out of that if that isn't their norm anymore, but unfortunately it is for many kids. We're also finding that there are certain areas of the brain that require more complex processing that are being underdeveloped by exposure to screen time at a young age. So these are areas of the brain such as language development, memory consolidation, the ability to feel empathy, which is very interesting, as well as the ability to read facial cues and body language. So it's definitely impacting young children who are spending more time looking at devices than interacting with real life humans face to face. Socially, I think it's kind of ironic because often these tools and these platforms are touted as social connectors, and yet they are leading to much greater levels of isolation and loneliness among young people than ever before. There's a lot of cyberbullying. You are opening the window to some very unhealthy social interactions that are happening with people. People can say things online that they would never dare say in person because there's anonymity behind a screen. And then even families are being fragmented by the presence of devices because if you've got both parents on their phones and all the kids are on their tablets, there's a lot of connection that isn't happening, a lot of conversations that aren't happening, and kids can feel lonely even within their own families. Boys and girls are both affected. They are affected differently. So boys tend to, these are generalizations of course, and there's a lot of overlap, but generally speaking, boys are drawn more toward online multiplayer video games, YouTube videos, Reddit threads, and hardcore porn. And girls are primarily drawn in by social media. So girls love social media for a number of reasons. Girls tend to they tend to vie for social status through looks. Girls have always done this, and social media is a fantastic platform to do that because they can portray themselves as hot or as beautiful, as appealing. And also girls tend to engage in a lot of relational aggression. That's just sort of this base instinct that females have when they're young. And again, social media is a super platform to do that. Girls also tend to share their emotions quite readily. And again, social media is always asking you. The more you share your emotions, the more validated you are for it. You get more content, your comments, you get more likes, you get more engagement. So it's sort of asking for that. Boys tend to reach out toward, they spend time on video games and porn because boys, it gives them an outlet for these so-called agency building activities that they tend to crave as well. So boys instinctively want to engage in exploration and competition and sort of playing at war and mastering skills. And these are virtual simulations of that make them feel like they are achieving things and accomplishing things. Unfortunately, they're nowhere near as effective as the real thing, and so these boys end up feeling very isolated, very lonely, and very disconnected from other people, as well as having no real life skills, because a skill that you develop on a video game really doesn't translate to reality in any way, shape, or form. So social media, it's interesting, it actually causes most harm to girls between the ages of 11 and 13, and it causes most harm to boys between the ages of 14 and 15. So that difference is partly due to maturity. Girls tend to mature a little bit more quickly than boys do. But I think that this is interesting because the legal minimum age that you need to be is 13 to sign up for a social media account right now in most of the world, although that might be starting to change in some places, not here. But I think this is important because 13 is a uniquely terrible age to give a kid a device or to give them access to social media because you are just at the most sensitive developmental period of these kids' lives. And this is why we should not let kids use social media before the age of 16 at an absolute minimum. For my kids, it's 18. So here's an example, just one example I threw up. This is an influencer on Instagram. So the girl on the right, her name is Josephine Livin. She just wanted to make an example of how filters can change a girl's appearance. So that's her regular look. And then she applied some Instagram filters, and now she looks like she does on the left. As you can see, they look like completely different people. What's difficult about this is that Instagram sets this impossible beauty standard for young girls. Not that I think the one on the left is more beautiful than the one on the right. I think the one on the right looks much lovelier than the one on the left. But the thing is, when I was young, my friends and I would pore over 17 magazine and look at the models and the celebrities and think, oh, imagine if we looked like that. But now young girls are scrolling through their Instagram feeds and they're comparing themselves to their classmates. You know, the girls that they go to school with, or the guys that they know at school, and no one looks real anymore. And so it just becomes very demoralizing to a lot of young women and young men that they cannot achieve this impossible standard of beauty. And things are so dire with young people and social media that the US Surgeon General last May called for an official warning, an official advisory against social media. And he said in light of having too little information as to whether or not these are actually safe, we should be taking extreme urgent action, I think is what he said, urgent action to protect our children from the damages caused by these platforms. So, you know, if the Surgeon General is issuing warnings, this is something that we should definitely be paying attention to. What I think is important for many parents to realize, and even if you're not a parent, I think this is still kind of an interesting point, is that your social media feed, if you have Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, any of these algorithm-driven platforms, your feed looks completely different than your child's or anyone else's. And the way that the algorithms work is essentially by creating a profile of you based on the information you offer, based on anything you like, any comments you make, as well as how many seconds you spend looking at a video versus another video. And they create this ever more detailed image of who you are, and then they feed you content based on this. And this is very powerful. I had a funny conversation with my sons a couple weeks ago. They were telling me about, it sounds absolutely horrible, but they were telling me that their friends at school during lunch, they watch car crash videos on Instagram. This is a common practice, I guess, among all these teenage boys, like horrific car crashes. It's this like voyeuristic thrill that these boys get from this, and I said, that's awful. And they said, well, don't you see car crashes on Instagram all the time? And I'd never seen one ever before. And so we pulled up Instagram and we were looking at it, and in my feed, there's cooking videos, there's like travel videos, you know, cute babies. It looked nothing like the feeds that they're seeing on their friends' phones. And so the thing is, you won't even see the same worlds depicted on these platforms, even though you might have, you know, the same presence. So what this translates into is quite an ugly, dark world that a lot of our children are inhabiting. TikTok is definitely the biggest social media platform. It's also the worst, arguably. There was a report published in 2022 by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, and they created hundreds of sort of fake accounts. They posed as 13-year-olds, and they found that within 30 minutes of just looking at random TikTok content online, they were being given content that was suggesting eating disorders and all forms of self-harm. And then also, if there are certain users who might be categorized as a bit more vulnerable, so they might put certain words in their own profile, so such as lose weight. If a young girl wants to lose weight, it puts that in her profile. What they found in this study was that those vulnerable users were 12 times more likely to be fed the self-harm and the eating disorder content than just the average user. So the algorithm is really exploiting any slight sign of weakness or insecurity in a person's profile. And they're seeing some pretty awful stuff. You can see on the left here, this is a pro-anorexic influencer who's quite popular. She looks like a skeleton. She's real, and she's encouraging young girls and boys to lose weight. There's a lot of self-harming content as well. And I've been talking to my kids about this because they're telling me about all the kids they know who cut themselves in school now, and I guess it's becoming very normalized in a way to like engage with razor blades and just all kinds of sharp implements to cut oneself as a way of feeling better. And even if it's not translating to actual reported incidents, it is normalizing it. And I think that that's very troubling, that the kids talk about it as if it's just, same as anything else. A lot of content, of course, that is encouraging people to lose weight. A lot of informal dietary information. So the boiled eggs diet, encouraging someone to eat boiled eggs for 2 weeks in order to lose 24 pounds in just 2 weeks. So kind of scary stuff. There are rising rates of teenage suicide. I'm going to show you some charts on that, but this was one particularly tragic incident. A UK teenager, Molly Russell, who killed herself at age 14. The Guardian said she had viewed large amounts of content related to suicide, depression, self-harm, and anxiety on Instagram and Pinterest before she died. And even the psychiatrist who reviewed her material for the court case was unable to sleep because it was so disturbing. This is a very sad chart that shows the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, some of the latest data on this. This is percentage of high school students who experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. It went from 28% in 2011 to 42% in 2021. That is a massive increase. And if you go down the list a bit more, you can see seriously considered attempting suicide, 22% of high school students in 2021, according to the CDC. Made a suicide plan, 18%.
This is total students or those interviewed?
These,
how does this data go?
I'm not sure.
Because sorry to interject.
Yeah.
Another disturbing thing is that these kind of surveys sometimes suggest to the students those very ideas that they attempt to gauge the presence of, even if they're not there. So
that's true. I have read about that as well.
I'm just curious what do those numbers actually represent?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how the CDC collects that. I know that Height's book does verify a lot of this, and I think the next stat, but this is still CDC, reported that this is 2023. In 2021, almost 60% of female students experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness during the past year, and nearly 25% made a suicide plan. And Jonathan Haidt has said that there was no change that was shown during COVID, because as he put it, social distancing had already begun for teenagers and had been ongoing for several years before that. So it didn't really make a difference in a way when COVID hit. We adults felt it more, but teenagers are already so socially isolated. They're spending so much time on their phones where they're feeling profoundly lonely, and it's often giving them a sense of hopelessness when it comes to life. And that's no way to live. That's a pretty terrible way to live. Even Pinterest, there's really no place that's safe on the internet. You sort of think about Pinterest as being a place for cooking videos and interior design ideas, but there have been some really distressing reports coming out about it being used for men creating sex-themed image boards of little girls. So often parents will let their young children have Pinterest accounts because it's seen as a safer option than TikTok, but it really is not. The UK Children's Commissioner report on porn is showing that the average age of first exposure to porn is 13 for both boys and girls. 27% of children have seen it by 11, 10% by age 9, and 94% of children have seen porn by age 14. And perhaps even more distressing, almost half of the respondents to the Commissioner's report, aged 16 to 21, believe that girls expect sex to involve physical aggression. So I once heard it said that the right age to give your child a smartphone is whenever you want to let them start viewing hardcore porn, because that's pretty much inevitable if you're going to give them that kind of device. And as we know, that is probably the worst way to teach a person to have a healthy sexual relationship with anyone in their life. Billie Eilish is a famous singer who says that watching porn as a child destroyed her brain. She came out as a real, just a couple of years ago, as sort of an anti-porn advocate. She had accepted it for so long, and now she says, I'm so angry that porn is so loved in our society, and I'm angry at myself for thinking it was okay. So a lot of kids are very much growing up in this environment where it's being normalized among the teens and the preteens, and it should not be. We need to be pushing back against that for sure. Sextortion is another issue that actually is growing rapidly and is affecting more boys. So 90% of sextortion cases in Canada affect boys more so. So this is when a boy is usually online. It does happen to girls too, but a stranger. There's a lot of chatting with strangers that happens online. So a stranger will reach out and send a message, and this chat starts out in a friendly way, and then it eventually turns flirty, and then the sextortionist will send a provocative picture and ask for one in return. And often the kid will reciprocate, because if it's a teenage boy, he thinks he's actually talking to a cute young girl who's interested in him. And it really doesn't take long before you feel flattered and you feel like you want to continue with this sort of feel-good relationship that's been started. And then the exchange turns ugly and threatening very quickly. And the sextortionist, as soon as they have a compromising image of the child, will threaten to post it online and shame the child in front of all of their friends, their family, their schoolmates, unless they send money or more images. Generally it's money if it's boys, generally it's more images if it's a girl, and this is quite distressing. So cybertip.ca is the Canadian government branch that is in charge of handling all kinds of sextortion reports. They get, so it says there, 10 sextortion reports per day. 10 may not seem very much across all of Canada, but those are only the ones that are reported, and this is something that is grossly underreported because there's a lot of shame associated with having perhaps made some poor choices in online interaction, and a lot of boys don't want to admit what's happened. But there are ways to delete a lot of those images from the internet. If you reach out to that organization, they can help. So in conclusion, this is kind of the end of the information part at the beginning. I don't think that there really is any way to keep a child truly safe if they have access to a smartphone or the internet. I do not think children should be banned from the internet by any means. I think that there are a lot of good things that kids can do online, but I think that to give a child a phone and to give a child access to social media platforms, especially at a young age before they are very mature, and to have it be unmonitored by a parent, I think is asking for maybe more problems than it's really worth. So we do live in a culture of misplaced fears, and I think that this is something worth considering, because right now as parents we tend to underprotect our children in the virtual world and we overprotect them in the real world. And what we need is actually an inversion of that. The real world is less scary than it used to be. It's certainly way less scary than the online world, and I think we need to have a lot more fear of what's happening online and less fear of what's happening in the real world. Some parents are still afraid of the idea of stranger danger, of a kid getting kidnapped in that stereotypical white van stranger scenario, but statistically, your child would have to loiter in public for 750,000 years before that would happen. So, you can spend a lot of time thinking about all of the bad things that phones do and social media does to your children, but I think we should also be thinking about what your kid isn't doing because they're online. Like, there's so many other experiences that they're just missing out on because they're on the devices, and I think that too is a compelling argument to curb excessive screen time. This is a wonderful description. I know it looks a little lengthy, but Jonathan Haidt says that smartphones reduce interest in all non-screen-based forms of experience. And this is an important point for all of us to think about, even in our own lives, whether we're parents or not. And he has this great quote that I'm going to read to you. Smartphones are like the cuckoo bird, which lays its eggs in other birds' nests. The cuckoo egg hatches before the others, and the cuckoo hatchling promptly pushes the other eggs out of the nest in order to commandeer all the food brought by the unsuspecting mother. Similarly, when a smartphone, tablet, or video game console lands in a child's life, it will push out most other activities, at least partially. And I see this time and time again with kids that I know. When you give a kid a device, there's no friction that exists between the sensation of boredom that they might have and the desire to be entertained and to do something. They can pick up that device and instantly be sucked into it and immediately have something to do. If you don't have that device, there's that friction point, that sticking point where you feel uncomfortable with your boredom. You don't quite know what to do with yourself. And so you push through it and you figure out something to do. You come up with a game, you find a playmate, you brainstorm, you go get materials to do a project of some kind or find a toy. And a kid will shift into that mode where they are able to entertain themselves eventually, given enough time. But if you never give them the chance to do that, it's less likely that it will happen. We've also seen a tragic decline of outdoor play. And this is just an astonishing comparison here. So the average kid in the United States gets on average 4 to 7 minutes of outdoor playtime every single day. At the same time, U.S. inmates are entitled to 2 hours of outdoor time every single day. So there was a funny little film that was made a few years ago where the inmates were asked what they would do if they lost their 2 hours of playtime every day, or if it was cut, or playtime, outdoor time, or if it was cut to 1 hour. And they said it was terrible. It would be such a infringement on their rights. And yet they were told that children are actually only just getting a few minutes a day. And we need to start thinking more of active outdoor play as a right, as something that children absolutely critically need, as much as they need to be fed and be given a safe place to sleep at night. So who's to blame? I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing these days, a lot of discussion. Who can make a change? This is a complicated question. I think that there are so many different factors at play. We've got parents, obviously, that need to, I think, step up to the plate and maybe rethink the way that they are approaching devices. We've obviously got to tighten up legislation. We need to change the laws surrounding the internet age of adulthood. So we need to increase the minimum age for kids to sign up for social media. We need to be enforcing those age minimums as well, because currently there's no way to enforce them, to follow up. We need to hold the tech companies accountable too for designing technology that they know is incredibly dangerous and damaging to a lot of children. All of these things are required. All of them need to happen. However, I can't really do much about the legislation, and I can't really do much about the tech companies, but I find that where I have the most power is at home, in my own home environment, with my children, with kids that I interact with. And I think that that's where we can start as parents. And it's not about shaming the parents and making parents feel bad that maybe we've, dropped the ball a little bit for a few years. But I think that we need to see it as empowering. We can do things and we can affect change right away, immediately, and make a difference in our kids' lives. So we have new information. There are new studies coming out every year. We have more information now than we did in 2010 or 2015, when we may have first given a kid a phone. I don't know. And I think that it's always acceptable to change your mind based on new information that you have acquired. We are also the first line of defense in our kids' lives. So I'd like to think of parents as sort of the gatekeepers. You're the ones through which things have to go between you. You're the mediator between your child and the broader world. We have influence over our kids' lives. Maybe not as much influence as we would sometimes like, but maybe more than we think. And that's also a fleeting period of time when you can influence your child. And I think of it as a time to train their future habits. They are going to be gone before you know it. And if you do not hold them to a certain standard of behavior, teach them how to engage with technology in a healthy way from a young age, it's going to be that much harder for them to figure it out down the road once they're older. We do have a responsibility, I think, to protect our kids as much as we can. So this is where I introduce this philosophy of digital minimalism, which I really love. This is the philosophy that I use with my own kids. The term was coined by an author named Cal Newport. He wrote a book called Digital Minimalism in 2019, and he describes it as a philosophy of technology use in which you focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected and optimized activities that strongly support things you value, and then happily miss out on everything else. So the wonderful thing about this philosophy is, as you can see here, it's not anti-tech, it's not screen-free. And I want to make that very clear that I'm not anti-technology. I am using plenty of technology right now to give you my presentation. My entire career has been enabled by Wi-Fi and a laptop and a smartphone and remote work, and I'm incredibly appreciative of that. I would not want to go back to a world where we don't have that technology. However, just because something is a great tool does not mean that it's a great toy. And we have to teach our children that this technology is incredibly powerful and very wonderful in many ways. But it needs to be treated with respect, and it needs to be treated with caution. And so the digital minimalist parent, which is what I strive to be, employs delay tactics when it comes to technology. So is willing to maybe not give a kid a phone just because everyone else's friends have one, but hold out for a bit longer. And every month and every year that you can hold out is a benefit. Create strict limits around digital media. So again, it's one of those things, just because everyone's doing something differently does not mean that you have to do it that way either. Digital minimalist parents strive to enrich a child's offline life. So recognizes that you have to give the kids things to do in their real life. Activities, things to look forward to, things to be proud of. And really strives to reclaim childhood. So I do believe that childhood is a critical developmental period. And we have an obligation to give kids that. Right now, I think that they're being robbed of it in many ways. And then digital minimalist parents will prioritize in-person interactions. So there's a time and place for virtual interactions. They can be helpful at times, but they are not as effective generally as in-person, and they should not replace in-person interactions completely. Some of the benefits of digital minimalism really are an inversion of many of the negatives I talked about before. You're going to have better regulated emotions. So kids who are not finding that they're spiking with the hormonal surge that you get, the dopamine surge you get when you see notifications or you see things online that you need to do. You're going to get kids who are a bit more creative, who start to develop some new skills because, as I mentioned before, there's that friction point that's allowing them to actually do different things. Kids' focus will improve, they'll be protected from online nastiness, and you're going to have less family tension. I've heard it from so many parents that family life is just sort of degraded into this constant battle over screen time. And what I've heard from other families who've gotten rid of the devices is that peace reigns once again because the root cause has sort of been weeded out. So these are my family's digital media rules. This is an evolving list. It sort of changes based on new information because I do believe that someone has to be flexible. But as of now, my strategy is based on sort of these 6 points. So delay, delay, delay. We're holding out as long as we can. My oldest son, who's 15, still does not have a smartphone. He is, as far as I know, the only kid in his high school who doesn't have one, and he's not happy about that. So second rule, no smartphone before 16. So the reason I had, for years, he would say to me, when can I have a smartphone? And I would say, I don't know. I really don't know, but it's not yet. And then I heard an interview with Dr. Jean Twenge, who is a psychologist from San Diego University. She wrote a book called iGen and Generations. And she has 3 teenage daughters, and she said her rule was 16. And the reason was that she views owning a smartphone being on par with driving a vehicle. You need the same level of maturity to operate a smartphone as you do to operate a car. And as soon as she framed it like that, I felt like it made more sense to me. You would not put an 11-year-old or an 8-year-old behind the wheel of a car. It doesn't matter if they know how to operate the vehicle. There's just too many other variables. There's just too much potential for risk and for harm to the child, to other people. They're just not capable of it. It's kind of the same thing with a smartphone. So my son can get a smartphone at 16. He will have to buy it himself and pay for it, and he still won't be allowed to have any social media on it. So then that raises the question, why do you have a smartphone if you're not going to be using social media? It might not make sense to spend that much money on it. Social media, a lot of people are saying 16 should be the minimum. I think 18 is a better minimum. Again, literally anything higher than 13 is going to be an improvement over what we're dealing with right now. No phones at school or in the bedroom. I'm going to get into school rules in a bit, but definitely not in the bedroom. That's one of the rules Jean Twenge said as well. If there's one thing you do not let your child ever take their phone into their bedroom because it compromises sleep and it affects their ability to focus on homework, and it's a recipe for disaster all around. We use computers to communicate. I find that that's a very effective way for my older kids to still engage in group chats. They can be part of their friends' group talks, but they're using iMessage on a desktop computer. And they still exchange their fair share of idiotic memes and like silly little videos, and I see this stuff coming in. But the difference is that they have that engagement for 10 minutes, and then they log off and they leave the house. And they go away. They don't have it with them in their pocket. They have to make plans to meet people. And sometimes people don't show up because the plans have changed in the interval of time between my kids reading a message on the computer and showing up at the place. But that's a hard lesson to learn, but I still think that it's worth the trade-off. And then we do have screen time for special occasions. They really do love watching movies. My sons, and we use Netflix on a laptop computer for that kind of thing. They often watch together. We watch as a family. Again, it's not anti-tech. It's just about finding the right time and space to use these tools in meaningful ways for all of us. Now, if you think that my stance is extreme, it's not the most. This is a diagram that is released by an organization called Screen Strong from the US. And as you can see, these are their recommendations. So toddlers should have no tablets. They should limit TV and always co-view it when possible. So that actually is an official recommendation from the American Pediatric Society that any baby or toddler should always co-view media with an adult, which I find sort of funny because the reason parents often will put their kids in front of the TV is so that they don't have to be with their kid. It's sort of a nice way to babysit them or pacify them for a bit. But even the APA says don't do that. Elementary school, you can let your kid use a landline or a talk and text only cell phone or a home phone. No video games or smartphones. Then you get to middle school, still no video games or smartphones. High school, you might give your kid a personal talk or text only phone, no video games or smartphones. And not until college does she say, the woman behind Screen Strong says, you could give your kid a smartphone with safeguards, still no video games. So with young kids, my motto is begin as you need to go on. I think that this is very helpful for a lot of parents. If you sort of establish a norm in your home and just say this is how we do it, little kids are very they go along with it. They accept what they're told often. They don't push back, especially if they don't know what they're missing because they're still little. They don't understand that maybe you do things very differently than other people do. And a key message here is it is harder to claw back technology than to just avoid introducing it in the first place. So if you can delay for as long as you possibly can, you're going to have less of a battle, really, than if you bring in the tablet and say, we're just going to limit it. We're just going to do a little bit because it's going to be very, very hard to take that tablet away once that habit has been established. So if you have a family, if you have children of all ages that are used to being on screens, I do believe that you can absolutely take away the devices. It's not going to be easy, but you can take away the devices. You can kind of reestablish a baseline for entertainment and for knowing how to spend time with themselves and play without relying on screens. You have to go through what's called the replacement phase. So this is when you get rid of the digital toys and you replace them with real toys, analog toys, and physical, active, outdoor play. You may need to buy more real toys or ask for them to be given to you by family and friends or buy them secondhand. But I find it's interesting to go into a lot of homes now, there aren't as many toys as you might expect because kids are spending all of their time on tablets. And I think that's sad because kids still instinctively do want to play with a lot of these physical things. I think kids are very embodied creatures. They like to handle things. They need to just interact with the world and learn how to manipulate their bodies around these objects in their lives. And they need to be given opportunities for that. Parents need to embrace messiness again and noise and chaos. Again, I don't know how much time you spend in homes where kids are on screens, but the homes are silent. And I'll often visit friends and all of their kids are tucked in their bedrooms with the door closed, and you wouldn't even know kids lived in that home because all of their play is online. And this strikes me as quite sad. You know, it's such a fleeting time that we get to enjoy the chaos and noise of children, and it'll be gone before we know it. And finding community can really help. There are like-minded people out there. I think if you can find just one or two other families that want their kids off devices and out in the streets playing or in the parks or whatever, you can definitely coordinate in order to make that easier. Do not be afraid of boredom. So I think as a culture, we are terrified of the concept of boredom. We try to stay very busy. Even as adults, right? We have this tendency now that we have the anti-boredom machine in our pockets. We don't want to spend a single minute alone with our thoughts. It's easier to just whip out the phone and start scrolling. And yet, it is a crucial ingredient when it comes to creativity. And it never lasts. So with children in particular, like I said, back to that friction idea, if you just say to them, go figure it out, they will. Children have a marvelous capacity to find things to do if they have to. There's a great quote from psychologist Csikszentmihalyi. He is the man who developed the concept of flow, how you can enter a flow state, which helps you, generate amazing creative things. He wrote in some of the research he did, only in solitude could those youths develop the creative habits, journaling, doodling, daydreaming, that lead to original work. So if we hope to have a society that has artists and musicians and writers and thinkers in it, we need people who are comfortable sitting in boredom and letting those skills develop. I wanted to talk a little bit about teenagers specifically, as this is arguably the toughest stage to be dealing with screens. It's the time when 95% of teenagers own smartphones. So if you're part of the 5% that doesn't, it can feel like a kind of lonely place to be. I do believe, though, you can delay phone ownership for a teenager. If it's not 16, make it 15. If it's not 15, make it 14. But we should not be giving kids phones at 8 or 9, which is now far more common than you might realize. You can take back the smartphone. I've talked to many parents who have traded in their kid's smartphone for a simpler device and said, I made a mistake by giving you a smartphone when I did. I'm no longer comfortable with you having this. You're going to have this other thing that meets the minimum requirement to be able to call and text and communicate, but does not open up this other can of worms to you that's obviously causing all kinds of social anxiety. You can deactivate social media. You can, it's very easy to go into the settings and simply deactivate the profiles. It doesn't even delete them. You just tell your kid you're deactivating it for 6 months. Maybe you're deactivating it for a year. Give it 2 more years. You don't have to delete the profiles. You can delete them. If that's too much of a step, some parents are choosing to get the social media apps off of their kids' phones and instead let their kids keep their social media profiles but only access them on a desktop computer. So again, we're fighting back against that portability concept. So the kid can log in once an evening, perhaps, to check their Instagram or whatever. And so they feel connected. They're not missing out completely, but they're not going to be looking at it 5 times during their English quiz like they are now. You can let your kid use your phone. So my husband and I both have smartphones. My sons are always using them to, not always, but if they need to borrow them to call a friend or send a text message or look up a bit of information or even have a FaceTime call with somebody, we'll let them do that. Again, it's about creating that healthy boundary. They're not capable of handling that thing on their own, of being the primary owner of that device. But there's no reason why they can't use it just for a minute or two here and there. And then help them fill that void. I think, too, this kind of gets back to that idea of the replacement phase. As parents, we do have a responsibility to a certain extent to help our teens develop interesting skills and habits and hobbies, and have things for them to look forward to. Whether it's going camping or going hiking on a weekend or hosting, a get-together, a social event. I think teens are at that awkward stage where they're kind of pulling away from their parents, but we also need to focus on keeping them close. You can use simpler devices. There are lots of options out there. I just realized I've been talking for 45 minutes. Oh no! I'll have to go a little bit faster here. You can do lots of different things like get landline. Freddie just got a landline installed in her house. It's only $8 a month. She's really excited about it. Again, you can use computers. You can talk about your schedule in person. I have a check-in with my kids every single morning at breakfast, and we just discuss where we all have to be and at what time. So smartphones, one thing I think is important to talk about is safety issues. So a lot of parents will give their teenagers smartphones because they want to keep them safe, which is a very understandable reason for wanting to do it. However, smartphones have been described as the world's longest umbilical cord, and I find that kind of funny because I think they are getting in the way of teaching real-life coping skills. And if your kid doesn't actually know how to function in the world without a smartphone, are they really safe? A phone can break, it can get stolen, it can fall in a puddle, and then if your kid doesn't know how to get from point A to point B without that device, they're definitely going to be in trouble. I also find that phoneless kids are more risk averse. So I had a conversation with a mom in Vancouver whose two daughters ride public transit. And these daughters don't have smartphones. They told their mother that they're hyper alert to any kind of creepy people who might approach them at the bus stop. And they know where people are in the vicinity at all times. And they were telling their mother that they're very concerned about a lot of the other teenagers they see who are completely cut off from the world. They have their headphones in, they're looking at screens, they're watching videos, and they have no idea who's around them at any given time. And I think in a situation like that, which is the safer kid, really? Just because they have a phone does not make them immune to attack or all kinds of sort of creepy encounters with other people. So I think parents need to think about what is safety really? What do you want to be teaching your child? I'm just going to have to skip a few, I guess. But parents, I think we do need to spend some time thinking about choosing what is hard. Like, it is hard to take a stand against digital media at a time when everybody seems to be giving it to everyone. But hard decisions can lead to an easier life. Easy decisions can often lead to a harder life. And I have had heartbreaking conversations with parents who have kids who have been hospitalized for suicide attempts, who have children with severe anxiety who can't even go to class anymore, like who are really suffering, police charges for, cyberbullying incidents online. And I think that is hard. What they're dealing with is just brutal. It's also hard to tell my son that I don't want him to have a phone, but I feel like you kind of have to choose what's hard. And I would rather be dealing with him not having a phone and feeling a sense of FOMO, perhaps, than having to deal with a kid who's been hospitalized for suicide attempts. So really, you sort of choose the battle that you want to fight. It's a lot of regret now. A lot of people are now resentful of their parents for having given them social media and phones at the age that they did. And that's sort of interesting, because I think now we need to be thinking, what could our children resent someday? Are they going to resent us not taking action and not setting the standard as high as it could have been? Parental modeling is very important too. How are we using our phones as parents? What kind of example are we setting for our children? Because as a parent, you are never not modeling. Every single thing you do is being witnessed by your child. What can schools do? Ontario's new policy is not a ban. This is a pet peeve of mine. Kids are still allowed to keep phones on their person. They're just not supposed to look at them unless the teacher gives them permission. So anything that allows a child still to carry a phone on their body during class time, as far as I'm considered, is not a ban at all. There was an infamous brain drain study from 2017 that found that the mere proximity of a phone inhibits a child's ability to focus on a test. So even if the phone was on silent, face down on the desk in front of the kid, they performed less well than if the phone was on the floor in a backpack. And those kids perform less well than when the phone was out in the hallway in a locker. So just the closer the phone is to you, the harder it is to concentrate. Parents should ask teachers to not use QR codes in class. That's been an issue with my son as well, because teachers sort of assume every kid has a phone on them, and they can just pull out their smartphone and pull up a QR code on the smartboard in order to access whatever resources they're studying in class. And a lot of schools are using social media for school-related groups, teams, clubs, and it's forcing a lot of families to let their kids get social media, because otherwise how are they going to know when their game practice times are? Things like that. So I think that that's an unfortunate shift. High schools, elementary schools should not be using social media, I think, with any sort of school-supported activities. I'm going to go through this. Life skills. So we do need to think about the life skills that a child needs. This is a great list created by a former freshman dean at Stanford University called Julie Lithcott-Haynes. She says that an 18-year-old should be able to talk to strangers, navigate a new location, manage school assignments, contribute to running a household, cope with the ups and downs of life, earn and manage money, and take risks. And it's important to realize that these are skills that you don't wake up knowing how to do on your 18th birthday. You need to start training for these from a young age. And this is where getting the kids off the devices, not spending between 5 and 9 hours a day for entertainment-based screen time, they're going to be able to develop a lot of these skills if they're more involved in the home, doing chores, and interacting with the family. That's sort of related. It's the purpose of childhood. We want to give our children a play-based childhood, not a phone-based childhood, because it is rehearsal for adulthood. It is a time for them to take low-stakes risks where they can mess up conversations, they can use their bodies, they can do all of these things without the potential consequences that will come when they are older. Lots of headlines. Lately, I'm feeling very optimistic. Things are changing. There's lots of rules changing. France, UK, Australia, England, all of these different places around the world do seem to be making steps toward limiting phones in schools, trying to get kids off of smartphones, bringing books back in and screens out in educational settings, which I think is a whole other conversation that's very interesting. So I'm feeling quite hopeful, despite how dire things might sound. It is never too late. As parents, you can always say no. That's probably one of the most common conversations I have with parents is they come and they say, tell me I can say no. Tell me it's okay to make a stand. And it absolutely is. You're not alone, and you don't need your kid's permission to do this. Your kid might even thank you someday if you do. Is the future analog? I'd like to just leave listeners with this one final slide, how I think the pandemic gave us this digital future that we were promised for so long, and we absolutely hated it. I think we realized just how awful it is to spend every single minute of your life on the internet. And we need to not let our children fall into that trap. Just because they maybe are drawn into it and it sort of seems normal right now, it's not a quality life. We need to want more for our children. And I don't buy this whole idea that we need to train our kids from a young age to use the technology that they do, because these tools are designed to be intuitive. We'll learn how to use them at a later age. And also the technology is changing so fast that it's not going to look the same in 5, 10, 15 years as it does now. So I think that the most important thing we can do for our kids is to give them the skills that set them apart from the machines. The skills that are the human skills that allow them to be able to interact with people in meaningful ways. That will make them be the most successful ultimately and the happiest, I believe. So that wraps up my presentation. I thank you so much for listening. I do have copies of my book available if anyone would like to purchase them. And I urge you to sign up for my email newsletter as well, The Analog Family, where I continue to talk about these things on a regular basis. So, and check out the Globe and Mail as well. You'll see me there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. There was a lot of content and food for thought in 50 minutes, which we really appreciated. And so now the floor is open for questions, comments that any of you may have, things you'd like to follow up on. Engage with Katherine about.
When you say that the platforms are designed to lure people in, children, so is it all about advertising revenue? Like what's the? Well, I mean, they're not created to create evil in the world.
No, I would say that they sort of cater to our instinct for validation. So I think the more you post, the more interaction you're going to get from other people. And we all crave interaction. We crave validation. We crave compliments as well. And so the more you post, the more response you get, and then that makes you want to go back and more makes you want to check to see. And there's also this intermittent reward network where you never really know what you're going to get when you refresh your news feed. So you might have a few notifications telling you that someone's liked a post, or you might not, and so then that makes you want to go back and check again in a few minutes to see if there's more. And then if there are comments, that makes you want to check again a few minutes later to see if someone else has said something. So it's kind of like this feedback loop where the more you post, just the more compelled you are to keep checking in. So it's just sort of an unhealthy, endless quest for compliments or validation, and yeah. And also, the more provocative, the more shocking content tends to get more attention as well. So it's sort of like a race to the bottom, if you will, in terms of what people are posting. Yes?
You compared giving a child a smartphone to learning to drive. So I'm wondering, is there any training that you think parents should give their children before giving them a phone, like driver's training?
Oh, interesting. I would definitely say, well, so I think delaying is key. You know, I don't really buy the argument that starting at a young age and sort of minimizing exposure and like easing them into ownership, that has sort of been debunked by some thinkers that I really respect. They think that it's important for kids to develop as many great life skills as they can before they get the device, because then the device will be less of a threat to social interactions, to personal interactions, to self-confidence, all of these other things. So become as established as you can be and mature as you can be as a human being before you even get the device. And then I would just say, I don't know, I'd say lots of limits for sure. You know, I would like, don't let the kid have that phone in their bedroom. At night, you know, set certain hours for use. I just not do social media at all. And definitely be talking about it all the time. I think parents do need to stay informed as to what's going on. And a lot of parents are sort of in denial, I think, about how ugly that world is. And teens aren't compelled to share that with their parents because it might cause some distress. But keep the lines of communication open for sure.
See, the best training is modeling, right? Like, I think that ultimately they will learn from adults.
I'm being part of the faith community. I've heard some stories of some churches, etc., synagogues, exploring the idea of a Sabbath, a digital Sabbath. You know, it could be one day a week. It could be Sunday or something like that. And try to get the congregation to buy into that. And also, you know, like during Lent, which is often a period where you give something up. I've heard of one congregation, I think down in Memphis, about giving up for an entire month.
Wow.
And a lot of people have signed on, but it's like 100,000 people. So it's a way of, I think, of getting buy-in and getting support from a group of people.
It's a great idea. There's a wonderful book called 24/6, written by Tiffany Schlein, and she's a Jewish writer from New York City. She writes about this whole concept of implementing the one 24-hour period every single week when the whole family goes offline. They turn off their phones, turn off their computers, and they just focus on each other. And she argues that it's a very effective way. Like if you can't pull back tech use the rest of the week, which is perhaps understandable for a lot of families, especially parents who work online and whatnot, this can just be a good way to reset and to spend time together as a family. And as you mentioned, to model to those kids that there are important things to do in that time that doesn't involve being online.
Katherine, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and you are a very engaging speaker. You're very animated. You make a great presentation. Do you have any videos?
I don't.
How did you get on TED Talks?
A few people have asked if I've done a TED Talk or if I would, and I'm definitely interested. I need to look into it. Thank you, though. Thanks for the vote of confidence. I'll do that.
I don't know how you get there, but...
I think you can apply. For a while I thought it was something that you had to sort of get picked to do, but I think there's an application process, so perhaps that's something I will be doing.
I think you're ready.
Thank you.
I'm just going to direct this to Arena. One Sunday we didn't have enough bulletins, and I had to call it up on my phone. I found it very hard to read my phone because texts were coming through and emails, and then you start looking at the weather because you're getting distracted, or a sports game or something, and I thought, I'm not going to use my phone again during church. And I've heard other people say the same thing. And even though you instruct the sides people to say, sorry, we don't have enough, but here's a QR code. It's hard.
Everyone has to take personal responsibility.
Exactly, so, but then you can't follow the service if you don't have the paper.
Well, yeah, you gotta choose, how many trees to kill, or whether you have to really focus, and, there's nothing, everything has a cost.
I think with respect to modeling, though, the pandemic has sort of done some harm in that so many people are working from home now. And I'm thinking of a niece who I help after school sometimes. And those two parents are both sitting in front of a computer. They have to work shifts. One starts at 7 a.m. They're right across the road from the school, so they don't require anyone to help them. But that's what the kids see, as they're sitting there.
Even I struggle with that too, because I work online as well, and I have my computer, and what I have found that helps me is so I start work at 5:30 in the morning, and I usually work for about 2 hours, and I stop, and I spend an hour with the kids in the kitchen, packing lunches and having breakfast between 7:30 and 8:30, and then they're off to school, and I can go back to my computer, and then I try to be done when they get home at 3:30, because I think it's important. I'm not always done, and they often complain about it. But it is it's important. I think it's even good for the adults though, because I think our own hours have expanded sort of to fill the time that we have now because we're working remotely. And it might benefit us as well as our children if we, really restrict it to that, 7, 8, 9 hours a day that we have to work, instead of just continuing because we can, because it's there. But it is a challenge. It's a real challenge for sure.
Well, I know there's still a lot of, questions and comments brewing in our minds. But it is a little past 6:30, and so I'm going to thank Katherine for her very engaging presentation and for taking all of our questions and comments. And I want to encourage those of you who are here, if you do plan to attend the service, Katherine will be around, but maybe we could start transitioning to our relaxed service over in the chapel. And thank you again, Katherine, for coming and enlightening us about this very important and pressing health issue. And it truly feels like a health issue. We don't always think of it that way, but a lot of how you framed it, I think, was really it's an alarm bell as well as a call for action. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.